Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this introduction to music psychology. My name is Dr. Helen Prior, and I'm a lecturer in music at the University of Hull. My colleague, Dr. Elaine King, is shown on the left of your screen, and she's a reader in music at the University of Hull. We're both music psychologists, and we put together this short introduction to give you a flavour of the kind of work that we're interested in, both in relation to our teaching and in relation to our research. In today's talk, we're going to introduce the idea of music psychology as a field of study, defining it and giving you a broad sense of the kinds of things music psychologists are interested in. We're going to spend a few minutes focusing on one key area of music psychology, that of music performance expertise. And finally, we're going to introduce you to some of the world-leading research projects we have in music psychology here at Hull. So, what is music psychology? Now, you're probably way more clued up than I was, but when I was at school, which was back when you had to put a telephone number into your computer to get access to the internet, I'd never heard of music psychology, and the only psychology I'd heard about was clinical psychology. So let's start with a definition. The British Psychological Society defines psychology as the scientific study of the mind and how it dictates and influences our behaviour, from communication and memory to thought and emotion. As they state, it's about what makes people tick and how our understanding of that can influence wider issues in society. So what about music psychology? Well, music psychology is the scientific study of human behaviour in relation to music. We study composers, songwriters, performers of all kinds, from babies to professional musicians, as well as music listeners. Music psychologists ask questions like, how do composers compose? How do musicians work together to create a piece of music? How and when do babies develop musical skills? What is the most efficient way to practice a musical instrument? What is it that makes expert performance so effective? Why do we experience emotions when engaging with music? How does background music influence people's behaviour when studying, when shopping, or when driving? So I hope that's given you a sense of the kinds of things music psychologists are interested in. Now, one focus of music psychology that can be really useful for students is the psychology of musical performance. So here's the lowdown on what music psychology research can tell us about practice, memorisation, and performance anxiety. So, practice. Did you know that it takes about 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert in something? Well, it turns out that 10,000 hour rule applies to music too. As a musician, you'll know just how important practice is. When we're talking about practice, we mean repeated action as a means of acquiring skill. Practice can vary a lot. Sometimes we play our instrument just for fun, just to enjoy the sounds we're making. Other times we practice in a highly structured way, with explicit goals. We structure our time carefully, monitor weaknesses in our playing, use specific tasks to combat those weaknesses, and concentrate intently while we're doing it. This latter type of practice has been defined as deliberate practice by two researchers on expertise, Cramp and Erickson. Now, both the quantity and the quality of deliberate practice are important, so let's look at those in turn. There's a clear relationship between hours of deliberate practice and expertise. Have a look at this graph, taken from work by music psychologist John Sloboda. The grey bars show how much practice was done between one grade and the next. The line shows the cumulative number of hours of practice pupils had done overall. He compared 5 different ability groups, but found no significant differences between them, suggesting that broadly, to get to a particular standard, you need to have accumulated a particular number of hours of deliberate practice. This link between quantity of practice and acquired skill is reinforced by other research by Cramp and Erickson, who looked at how many hours of practice have been accumulated by violinists of different standards. Looking at the bar chart on the right, you can see that the best violinists had accumulated more hours of practice than the good violinists, and in turn they had accumulated more hours of practice than those violinists who intended to be teachers. But they also found out some more details of the practice time. The best violinists did several short practice sessions with breaks throughout the day, distributed their practice evenly across the week, and preferred practicing in the middle of the day, between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. They also found that sleep was important for effective practice. Although quantity of practice is very important, other factors can influence the effectiveness or the quality of the practice that you do. When we're thinking about the best ways of doing things, it's a good idea to get empirical evidence from observing novices and experts to help us to find strategies to improve what we do. A study by Linda Gruson did exactly that, and found that novice pianists tended to spend more time doing uninterrupted playing than experts, but made more errors and repeated more single notes. Experts, however, made more repetitions of sections of music, and overall she found that novices had a strategy of playing pieces all the way through, hoping that mistakes would be ironed out, whereas experts would divide their pieces into chunks to practice, repeating those chunks until they were correct. This notion of chunking has also been seen in later research by authors such as Aaron Williamson and Elizabeth Valentine, who also found that the pianists who eventually gave the best performances in their study practiced shorter chunks at the earlier stages of practicing a piece, but had progressed to longer chunks by the middle stages of learning. Similarly, Roger Chaffin, Gabrielle Imre and Mary Crawford's work shows that Imre, a professional pianist, practiced chunks of pieces, but also allocated her practice time according to the difficulty of the music, having a specific goal in mind as she was playing. So to summarise, expert musicians do practice a lot, but they make the most of their practice time by getting plenty of sleep, practicing for several different periods of time in one day, structuring their practice carefully with clear goals to achieve, dividing their pieces into small chunks and repeating those chunks, and making those chunks bigger as they get to know the piece. Let's move on to another question. Should you perform from memory? In 2014, the Chiara String Quartet was featured in the Strad magazine because they'd started to perform from memory. This is not standard practice for a string quartet, but these players had found that playing from memory released them from, as they put it, bickering over tiny details in an ever-expanding quest for perfection, and it allowed them greater expressive freedom. Let's have a listen and you can judge for yourself. Having watched that, you'll have your own ideas about the benefits those musicians may have gained from memorising the music they were playing. But let's look at what music psychology research can tell us about it. As early as 1915, Hughes noticed the freedom of expression and greater psychological connection with the audience that could be gained from memorised performances. John Sloboda in 1985 commented that memorisation frees the performer's eyes from the score and guarantees the availability of information about what is to come next, but notes that the performer must know the music thoroughly. The first systematic study on the value of performing from memory was conducted by Aaron Williamson in 1999. He recorded 5 performances from some Bach cello suites by the same cellist under different conditions. The first condition was with the music with the stand visible. After a month, he recorded the cellist in 4 further conditions: with the stand but without the music, without the music or the stand, with the stand and with the music, and without the stand visible but with the music. He then asked audiences of musicians and non-musicians to rate the performances in terms of their overall quality, musicality, technical proficiency and communication. Williamson found that audiences generally preferred the memorised performances. These received higher ratings. The visibility of the performer influenced the ratings, so in other words, the music stand was an obstruction. The extra month spent preparing for memorised performances was beneficial. And interestingly, musicians were biased in favour of performances without the music stand visible. It's worth bearing in mind that these were videotaped performances, not live ones, and the performer was not an eminent soloist. We also don't know whether other pieces of music or instruments might yield different results. Further research is needed, but in this study, memorised performances without a music stand did seem to be received more favourable than the ones with a music stand. So looking at that evidence, you might decide to memorise your performance. So how should you go about doing that? Empirical research in this area by people like Susan Hallam, Rita Aiello, Roger Chaffin, Jane Ginsburg and Aaron Williamson suggests that we use 4 types of musical memory: oral, to do with the mind's ear or sound image; visual, to do with the mind's eye, the image of a printed page, seeing finger or hand positions; kinesthetic memory, so finger, muscular or tactile memory; and conceptual or analytical memory, so key ideas about music, such as form, phrasing or themes. Individuals usually have their own preferences for particular memory types, and Hallam found that there was no difference between an individual's preferred memory type and the quality of a given performance. So any of those 4 memory types can lead to very high quality performance. Knowing which kind of memory type you rely on can be helpful, and you might consider trying out the other types to consolidate your memory of the music. Memorising involves attention and repetition, for example, of chunks of the music during practice time. It's also helpful to develop different types of landmarks or cues, such as technical, expressive or interpretative cues. A third area of performance research that's very useful is the idea of music performance anxiety and how to manage it. So performance anxiety can be defined as the experience of persisting distressful apprehension about and/or actual impairment of performance skills in a public context to a degree unwarranted given the individual's musical aptitude, training and level of preparation. It's very common. Various studies have suggested that between 24% and 70% of professional orchestral musicians experience music performance anxiety severe enough to impair their performance. Paul Lehrer divides the symptoms of performance anxiety into 3 categories: physiological symptoms, cognitive symptoms, and behavioural symptoms. So, physiological symptoms include a rapid heartbeat, sweaty palms, shaking, dry mouth, increased agility, speed and strength, nausea, increased mental alertness, readiness, and peripheral vasoconstriction, so cold hands and feet. Cognitive symptoms are related to the thoughts that you're having. So they might include worry about evaluation, failure, or even worry about being worried, catastrophizing, self-handicapping, and negative thoughts. Behavioural symptoms include phobias, so avoiding doing something, which is a natural response to anxious situations but isn't actually helpful. An incubation effect, so staying away from anxious situations, and a hothouse effect, which is undue acceleration and pressure of learning, which can generate enormous anxiety. So we can think about hurried children, prodigies, or people who've been pushed too soon. None of those symptoms are pleasant, but it's worth investigating the factors that influence them. Elizabeth Valentine suggests that music performance anxiety levels are dependent on a combination of three factors: the person and their attributes such as their trait anxiety, the task in relation to its difficulty, and the situation, for example, whether a performance is formal or informal, or an exam or a concert. All of these factors will vary, and these variations will result in different levels of anxiety. Researchers have also suggested that some anxiety might actually be beneficial for performance, because it heightens our awareness and concentration. Now, there are various models of optimal anxiety, which take into account various different aspects of the person, task, and the situation, but they all agree that the area of optimal performance is not the area with least anxiety, but an area with some significant anxiety. Nevertheless, if anxiety increases to the point that is too high, the performance then deteriorates. So how can you reduce anxiety if it's too high? Well, symptoms can be reduced with medication, but this does have disadvantages ranging from side effects to dependence, so we wouldn't really encourage this approach. General healthy lifestyle tips are recommended for reducing all anxiety symptoms, so that includes making sure you get plenty of sleep, regular aerobic exercise, a healthy diet, and not too many stimulants like caffeine. If you're particularly wanting to manage physiological symptoms, learn techniques such as the Alexander technique, Eastern regulation techniques, systematic desensitization, autogenic training, hypnotic suggestion, and biofeedback can both reduce underlying anxiety and give ways of dealing with symptoms and they arise. When you're actually experiencing physiological symptoms, you might sometimes need a short-term, high-impact solution. Breathing techniques and self-talk techniques such as the quieting response can really help with this. If you need to reduce cognitive symptoms, there are a number of things to try. First, try to anticipate the anxiety you expect to feel on stage. Experienced musicians feel nervous before a performance rather than during it, so the damaging peak of anxiety is passed before the performance begins. The other techniques within this list all focus on changing thought patterns, blocking anxious thoughts, or visualising and thinking about positive aspects of the performance. All these can be very helpful in reducing cognitive symptoms of anxiety. Finally, there are several techniques designed to reduce behavioural symptoms. It is really important to keep performing. The more times you do it, the easier it will become. Do try to recognise any avoidance behaviours and address them. And if you have a bad performance experience, then try again as soon as you can. It's just like falling off a horse. You need to get back on again straight away. So, top tips for performers. What can you take away? Practice really does make perfect, but the quality of your practice matters just as much as your quantity. Memorising your performance has lots of advantages. Use chunking and experiment with different memory types. And finally, performance anxiety isn't always bad, but if it is debilitating, make sure you have a healthy lifestyle and experiment with breathing and self-talk. Above all, keep performing. Finally, I want to give you a bit of information about some of the research projects Hull researchers have undertaken. We've researched a diverse range of topics, from music and emotion to familiarity, from empathy to perfectionism, from the ways ensembles interact in rehearsals to the gestures they use when performing, and from the ways in which classical performers use ideas about shape to create an expressive performance, to the ways in which DJs and other popular musicians create their music. I want to focus on a few projects that we're currently working on, all of which have particular relevance to society in different ways. First, Strokestra. A team from the University of Hull is investigating the effectiveness of the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra's music therapeutic programme for stroke patients and carers. The RPO are working with Hull and East Riding's community stroke services to implement the programme, which involves fortnightly workshops where patients and carers come together with nurse practitioners and RPO musicians to make music together, including composing and improvising music as well as performing on orchestral instruments. The programme targets individual patients to support physical, social, cognitive and emotional recovery after stroke. A preliminary report indicated that the programme provided positive impacts for the patients, carers and others, including the nurses supporting the patients and the musicians delivering the sessions. The whole team is providing a formal, independent inquiry into how the programme is implemented and experienced, and we look forward to reporting the data. Second, the Chinese Whispers project is an education and community singing project that has two broad aims. First, to teach people Mandarin Chinese through singing, and second, to increase awareness of Chinese culture. Even though singers who rehearse and perform together on a regular basis can sing songs that are in native and foreign languages, this dedicated programme focuses specifically on the learning and teaching of Mandarin Chinese. A team of researchers is working on composing new songs and arranging traditional songs with Chinese words and accompanying actions so that pupils in primary and secondary schools, including those taking GCSE Chinese, as well as adults in community choirs, can learn the language and experience aspects of Chinese culture. The material is taught by specialist Chinese music tutors in weekly choir sessions. Researchers are also investigating people's experiences of singing in Chinese to find out more about how the project is impacting our lives. Finally, in the Connect Resound project, a team of researchers at the University of Hull worked with youth music charity NIMAS to enable more children and young people to receive music making and enrichment opportunities using online technologies. The initial focus of the project was to use technology to overcome the barriers to music education presented by rural isolation, namely travel times and cost. And we evaluated the project in terms of its effectiveness, but also in terms of the behaviour that actually happened in the lessons. We found that behaviours were remarkably similar in online and face-to-face settings, with the only significant difference being that the level of accompanying was lower in online lessons because of the technical issues like lag time needing to be overcome. Overall, we found that pupils progressed well in the online lessons and that teachers were willing to use the method in the future. And this research had particular resonance over the last 6 months, with music hubs moving to online tuition during the COVID-19 pandemic. You've had a bit of a whistle-stop tour of music psychology over the last 30 minutes or so. Hopefully you now have a better sense of what music psychology is and what music psychologists do, as well as some takeaway top tips about how to improve your musical performances. If you'd like more information, do have a look at the University of Hull's Music Department website or get in touch with either Elaine or myself. Thank you very much for listening.